What is globalization? It's a word we throw around a lot, and we assume we all understand the same meaning. Let's turn to a source that is itself a product of globalization. Wikipedia defines globalization as the process of international integration arising from the interchange of worldviews, products, ideas, and other aspects of culture. Advances in transportation and telecommunications infrastructure, including the rise of the telegraph and the internet, are major factors in globalization, generating further interdependence of economic and cultural activities. Because of the dominance of the United States in world affairs and economic trade, many have come to understand globalization as Americanization. It is a mistake to confuse these two phenomena. I know that many Americans think of the French as being against globalization, but the reality is that the French economy is as globalized as the American economy. Multinational corporations that are household names in America are actually French companies. Michelin, Sephora, Danone, L'Oreal. France has the 6th largest economy in the world. That cannot be achieved in isolation. Many Americans also think that the French economy is protectionist. This is another misperception. France protects its national production no more than the United States protects its own. For example, the U.S. government heavily subsidizes its agricultural industry, gives significant tax breaks to its highly profitable oil and gas industries, and it imposes import tariffs on many products to protect American companies from competition from abroad. As a founding nation of the 28-member European Union, France has in fact much more experience than the U.S. in negotiating global partnerships on critical issues of national interest, such as foreign policy, national defense, environmental safety, and labor laws. Now, even though France has a globalized capitalistic economy, the French state puts limits on globalization in one very particular realm, the realm of culture. When it comes to culture, such as film, television, music, and literature, France has stood up and said no to the free market. Cultural exception is the idea that culture should be exempted from the laws of supply and demand. Cultural production should not have to bear the brutal judgments of mass audiences and the pressures of profit maximization. This is the notion of cultural exception, or l'exception culturelle. Cultural exception is not just a government policy. It's a belief that has the broad support of French public opinion. Both right and left political parties in France embrace cultural exception, and they pay equal rhetorical heed to a humanized or controlled globalization, particularly when it comes to culture. Here's how the French ensure that culture is not commercialized: through taxes, subsidies, quotas, and regulations. In film, a tax is imposed on ticket sales in French movie theaters, including on foreign, read American films, which then goes to subsidize the creation of French films. In television, quotas are imposed. 60% of programs shown must be European, and of those, 40% must be French. In music, there are also quotas. 40% of songs played on primetime radio must be French. In literature, the price of books is regulated, which keeps online discount retailers at bay. It allows independent bookstores to stay afloat, and it enables publishing houses to offer books that might not become bestsellers. Finally, France has convinced its European neighbors of the value of cultural exception, and the EU now allows all member states to exempt culture from trade agreements. Let's try to understand why France rejects the stance that cultural products are merely products, and instead why it views culture as a hallmark of national heritage. During the trade negotiations where France first imposed its view of cultural exception, the American head of Hollywood's Motion Picture Association, Jack Valenti, famously retorted, "Culture is like chewing gum, a product like any other." Here, the opposing French and American ideologies about culture are thrown into high relief. For most French, there is the belief that culture is not a commercial good. It is something else. It represents the spirit, the soul, the sentiments of a society, the very identity of a nation. Therefore, it must be protected. France views its own cultural heritage as one of quality, not quantity. There is wide public consensus that providing quality options in the cultural sector is a public service. Indeed, it is a responsibility of the state. Charles de Gaulle created a French Ministry of Culture in 1959. Many French believe it is important to preserve global cultural diversity from the homogenization or the uniformization that happens naturally with globalization when its supply of cultural goods is made to appeal to the largest, therefore lowest, common denominator of mass opinion. Cultural supply ultimately affects cultural demand. What's available affects tastes and desires in the long run. The French belief is that diversity benefits everyone. Governments must intervene to stop unchecked globalization from crushing cultural diversity. Finally, if these lofty goals about cultural exception don't make sense to some of you non-French students, then let's talk numbers. Let's consider some statistics that show just how much American cultural exports dominate abroad. Before the quota on French radio, 80% of all music was British or American. Today, American films constitute in some European countries 90% of all movies shown in theaters. In France, thanks to cultural exception, American films are only about half of all films. And in television, because American series make their targeted profits in the domestic market, these ready-made products can be exported at steep discounts. Without quotas imposed on the free market system, foreign television channels are hard-pressed to purchase expensive homegrown TV series when American imports are a fraction of the cost. There is an economic term for this international trade practice: dumping. So yes, cultural exception protects French industries and French jobs. The French policy of cultural exception is not a form of anti-Americanism, as Americans might think. Even though the French are more vocal than its European neighbors about Americanization and mass culture, the French have been among the earliest admirers of American cinema and rock and roll since the mid-20th century. And it is in the domain of literature and publishing that France is a veritable globalized cultural sponge compared to the navel-gazing and provincial United States. 33% of newly published works of fiction in France are translations from other languages, a majority of which are from English. In contrast, less than 1% of new fiction published in the US are translations from foreign languages. The causes for this commercial trade imbalance are linked to America's minimal commitment to teaching foreign languages in American high schools and the market imperatives that plague American publishers. Over 80% of the books that actually are translated into English are published by independent, nonprofit, or university presses, not by the major American publishing houses. Wildly famous foreign authors are often translated into dozens of other languages before an American editor might notice. When it comes to translation and publishing, America may take a cue from France's more open and globalized approach to cultural diversity. As an American, I worry about the cultural and political ramifications of America's insular attitude and complacent disregard of literature and ideas from abroad, as evidenced from our infinitesimal rate of translations. But on a more optimistic note, for this module on America through French eyes, I'm tickled to report that among the translated books that are published in the US, French books rank the highest of all foreign languages. Some Americans do really care about what the French think.